The camera pans across a master bedroom draped in velvet and sunlight. On the vanity, Evelyn hums a hymn as she carefully polishes her silver wedding band with a white cloth. But beneath her feet, in the soundproof darkness of the basement, her husband Mark stands over a black stone altar, his corporate tie loosened, pouring expensive vintage wine into a silver bowl that never seems to fill. The narrator's voice breaks the silence, a prayer in the morning, a blood oath in the evening. Before you say I do, ask yourself, do you truly know the God your husband serves when the world isn't watching? Evelyn and Mark were the envy of the city, a high-flying power couple who seemed to bridge the gap between faith and fortune. They lived by a secret covenant of modernity. She kept her chapel, and he kept his business brotherhood, promising that the shadows of his ambition would never darken her doorstep. For 5 years, their luxury was their shield, and their love was a perfect, polished mask. But as their 5th anniversary draws near, a sudden, inexplicable rot begins to take hold. The bank accounts remain full, but the air in their mansion has turned ice cold, and the brotherhood has stopped calling Mark's office. They've started calling his home. The echoes of I do had barely faded from the cathedral rafters when the first shadow was cast. It was a wedding that the city would talk about for years, a sea of white lilies, a 10-tier cake, and a groom who looked at his bride as if she were the only soul inhabiting the earth. Evelyn, draped in heirloom lace, felt the weight of the silver band on her finger like a seal of divine approval. She believed she was entering a sanctuary, a life where her faith would be the cornerstone and Mark's strength would be the walls. But as the celebration moved to their new estate and the guests drifted away into the night, the air shifted. While Evelyn knelt by their bedside to offer a prayer of gratitude, Mark excused himself, claiming he needed a moment to settle his mind after the day's excitement. He didn't go to the balcony or the kitchen. He descended into the bowels of the house, into a room that hadn't appeared on the blueprints. There, in the oppressive silence of the unlit basement, he stood before a rough-hewn slab of obsidian. He didn't pray, he negotiated. He repeated the words whispered to him by the elders of the brotherhood, words that tasted like iron and ash. My success for my lineage, he murmured into the dark, sealing a covenant that Evelyn would not discover for years. The house was a gift, but it was also a cage, and the bars were forged the very moment the sun went down on their first day as husband and wife. There is a strange comfort in believing you know someone completely, a peace that comes from trusting the heart beating next to yours. If you've ever felt that quiet, bone-deep connection to a story or a soul, perhaps you'll choose to subscribe and walk this narrow path with us until the very end. The rot didn't begin with a crash, it began with a frost. By their 3rd year, the warmth that usually filled their home started to evaporate, replaced by a draft that no heater could touch. It coincided with the first time Mark's prestigious firm faced a federal audit. Panic should have been the natural response, but Mark remained eerily calm, spending more and more time in his private library. Evelyn would pass the heavy oak doors and feel a prickle of static electricity against her skin, a sensation of being watched by eyes that didn't belong to the living. The financial crisis loomed like a guillotine, yet Mark's lifestyle only grew more decadent. New cars appeared in the driveway, and diamonds were draped around Evelyn's neck like glittering shackles. Don't worry about the numbers, Eve, he would say, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. The brotherhood looks after its own. She wanted to believe him, but the atmosphere in the mansion was curdling. Flowers wilted within hours of being placed in vases. The mirrors seemed to hold reflections a fraction of a second too long. Evelyn found herself carrying her Bible from room to room, not for study, but for protection, as the house itself seemed to breathe with a heavy, rhythmic pulse that matched the pounding of her own heart. The transition from suspicion to dread arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while Mark was away at a consultation. Evelyn was organizing the library, the one room Mark insisted on cleaning himself, when she knocked a heavy brass bust off the desk. It hit the floorboard with a hollow, metallic ring. Prying up the loose wood, she didn't find dust or old letters. She found a single, ornate iron key tied with a ribbon of dried skin. It felt unnaturally cold, a deep, sub-zero chill that numbed her fingers instantly. Driven by an impulse she couldn't name, she followed the invisible pull of the house toward the servants' stairs. The key fit the heavy, unmarked steel door behind the wine cellar perfectly. As the lock tumbled, the air that rushed out was thick with the scent of old wine and something metallic, like a butcher's shop in the heat of July. She didn't go inside. She couldn't. The darkness beyond the threshold felt physical, a wall of intent that pushed against her chest. She locked the door and fled back to the sunlight of the kitchen, but the image of that iron key burned in her mind. She realized then that the modernity Mark promised was merely a shroud for something ancient and hungry. When Evelyn discovered she was pregnant, she hoped the new life would finally chase the shadows from the corners of their home. For a few months, Mark was transformed. He was attentive, joyous, and stayed away from the library. But the day their daughter, Sarah, was born, the business partners finally came to the house. They arrived in a fleet of black sedans, men in charcoal suits with faces as expressionless as granite. They didn't bring baby gifts. Mark met them in the foyer, his face turning the color of parchment as the lead man whispered a single sentence into his ear. Evelyn, watching from the top of the stairs with Sarah cradled in her arms, saw her husband's knees buckle. That night, the celebration was a hollow affair. Mark sat by the nursery window, his gaze fixed on his daughter with a look of profound, agonizing mourning. "She's so perfect," he whispered, his voice cracking. They always want the things that are perfect. The debt he had signed away on their wedding night had finally matured, and the interest was not in currency, but in the soul of the child who had just taken her first breath. The clock struck 3 a.m., the hour when the veil is thinnest, and Evelyn woke to an empty bed. The silence of the house was absolute, save for a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She threw on a robe and followed the sound, her bare feet silent on the marble. The basement door was ajar, a sliver of flickering, crimson light spilling out into the hallway. The smell was unbearable now, bitter sulfur mixed with the sweet, cloying scent of frankincense. She crept down the stairs, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. In the center of the hidden room, Mark stood draped in a robe of deep scarlet, his back to her. He was lifting a chalice over Sarah's bassinet, which had been placed atop the black stone altar. "Accept the lineage," he intoned, his voice distorted and heavy. "Take the fruit to preserve the tree." Evelyn let out a strangled gasp, and the chanting stopped. Mark turned, his eyes glazed and vacant, his face a mask of sweating terror. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a hollow vessel for the Brotherhood's demands. "Get away from her." Evelyn's voice was a whip crack in the stagnant air. She lunged forward, snatching Sarah from the bassinet before Mark could react. Backing away into the corner of the ritual chamber, she stared at the man she had called husband. The altar was stained with more than just wine, ancient symbols were etched into the stone, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. Mark dropped the chalice, the liquid splashing like blood across his feet. "You don't understand, Eve," he sobbed, falling to his knees. "I tried to stop them. I tried to pay with the farm, with the houses, with everything. But the oath is blood-bound. If I don't give her to the Brotherhood, they won't just kill me. They'll erase us. They'll take my soul and yours." "Then let them take it," Evelyn hissed, clutching the crying infant to her chest. "But you will not touch this child." "It's too late," Mark whispered, looking past her toward the shadows in the corner of the room that seemed to be lengthening, stretching toward them like reaching fingers. "The contract was signed the day we said I do. I traded her future for our present." It is a devastating moment when you realize the person you built your life around is the very person who might destroy it. If this story has made you look closer at the world around you, perhaps you leave a comment with your thoughts on how one survives such a betrayal. We all need a place to share the weight of these reflections. Evelyn didn't wait for him to stand. She turned and sprinted up the stairs, the adrenaline turning her blood into liquid fire. She heard Mark shouting behind her, but it wasn't a call for her to stop, it was a warning. "They are coming, Eve. They are already at the gate." She didn't grab her jewelry or her passport. She grabbed the diaper bag she had packed in a moment of maternal intuition weeks ago and her Bible. She reached the mudroom just as the heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway groaned open. She couldn't take the car, it was equipped with a tracker. She scrambled through the kitchen window, dropping into the damp mulch of the garden. The night air was freezing, but she welcomed the sting. She ran toward the woods at the back of the estate, Sarah's small cries muffled against her shoulder. Behind her, the mansion erupted into a flurry of motion, headlights cutting through the mist, the sound of heavy boots on the gravel. She didn't look back until she reached the highway, her breath coming in ragged hitches, a ghost in the darkness fleeing a life that had been alive from the very first kiss. 10 years passed in the grey light of a town that didn't appear on most maps. Evelyn was no longer the polished socialite in lace and diamonds. She was Mary, a quiet seamstress who lived in a cramped apartment above a bakery. Her hands were calloused, and her eyes were always guarded, but Sarah was safe. Sarah grew up in the pews of a small, sun-drenched church, her laughter a defiant melody against the silence of Evelyn's past. They lived in a state of perpetual vigilance. Every black car that slowed down on their street made Evelyn's heart stop. Every stranger who lingered too long at the bakery counter was a potential assassin. She raised Sarah on stories of a father who had passed away in a tragic accident, a lie that grew heavier with every passing year. Evelyn had traded her luxury for peace, her status for her daughter's soul. She thought she had outrun the death, but the brotherhood has a long memory and a reach that spans across the invisible lines of the world. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday, tucked inside a nondescript envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of the bakery where they lived and a note written in Mark's shaky, uneven hand. I am dying, Eve. The brotherhood is finished with me. But the debt is not settled. They are coming for her. Come home, and I will show you how to break the seal. This is my last confession. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table for hours, the paper trembling in her hand. Part of her knew it was a trap, a lure to bring the prize back to the altar. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the man Mark was before the shadows took him, believed him. Sarah was 10 now, and the code had started to find them again. Sarah had begun having nightmares of a black stone altar and a man in a red robe. The curse was manifesting. Evelyn realized she couldn't keep running. She had to turn and face the darkness that had birthed her daughter. As we prepare to enter the final sanctuary of this story, we want to thank you for walking this haunted road with us. Your presence here honors the struggle of those who fight for the light. If this journey has moved you, please consider a final gesture of support, perhaps by liking or sharing this reflection with someone who believes in the power of a mother's love. The mansion was a skeletal ruin of its former glory. The gardens were overgrown with thorns, and the windows stared out like the eyes of a corpse. Evelyn entered through the front door, Sarah clutching her hand, the iron key from a decade ago heavy in her pocket. The air inside was stagnant, humming with a low-frequency vibration that made her teeth ache. She found Mark in the basement, but he wasn't standing. He was fused to the black stone altar, his body withered and translucent, his life force being slowly siphoned away by the very symbols he had etched. You came, he wheezed, his eyes rolling toward her. Tell me how to stop it, Evelyn demanded, her Bible held like a shield. The seal isn't on the stone, Mark whispered, a tear of blood tracking down his cheek. It's in the blood. My blood. And yours. The only way to break the debt is to destroy the vessel. Suddenly, the shadows in the room solidified. The men in charcoal suits stepped from the darkness, their eyes empty voids. The child, they said in unison, their voices a tectonic grind. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She didn't pray for a miracle, she became one. She grabbed the wine chalice and smashed it against the obsidian altar with a strength that shouldn't have been hers. As the stone cracked, she poured the contents of her water bottle, water she had consecrated in her small church, into the fissure. The reaction was violent. A blinding white light erupted from the altar, clashing with the crimson glow. Mark let out one final, relieved sigh as his body dissolved into ash. The Brotherhood figures recoiled, their forms flickering and dissolving like smoke in a gale. Evelyn grabbed Sarah and ran as the mansion began to groan, the very foundation collapsing as the life-debt was forcibly annulled. They reached the lawn just as the roof buckled, a pillar of fire rising into the night sky. The cage was gone. The debt was paid in ash and fire. Standing in the red glow of the burning past, Evelyn looked at her daughter. For the first time in 15 years, the air was warm. The marriage had almost destroyed her, but the mother had survived to tell the tale.